In the 1960s, public transportation across the Americas stood at a crossroads, embodying both the lingering momentum of an earlier industrial age and the unmistakable pull of a new automotive era. It was a time when millions still depended on buses, streetcars, subways, and intercity coaches to navigate daily life, yet the writing was increasingly on the wall, or perhaps on the billboards lining the newly built highways, suggesting that personal cars were about to take center stage. The systems that moved people were functional, often crowded, occasionally unreliable, and almost always affordable, carrying with them a certain unpretentious charm that made riding public transit feel like participating in the shared rhythm of society, even if that rhythm sometimes involved unexpected delays or standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers. The United States provides the clearest illustration of this transitional decade. Urban buses had firmly established themselves as the primary mode of city transport, and no vehicle symbolized this better than General Motors' New Look series, introduced in 1959 and proliferating rapidly throughout the 1960s. These buses, with their distinctive curved windshields that earned them the nickname fishbowls, featured modern styling, larger windows for better visibility, and improved passenger flow. Cities from coast to coast adopted them enthusiastically. New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Detroit, and countless smaller municipalities put thousands into service. Inside, passengers sat on vinyl benches that could feel sticky in summer heat, gripped overhead straps during sudden stops, and listened to the rhythmic hiss of air brakes. Drivers, often in crisp uniforms, collected fares in coin boxes that clinked satisfyingly with each deposit. Exact change required, naturally, because making change while steering through traffic was nobody's idea of efficiency. Fares remained remarkably low by today's standards, hovering between 15 and 30 cents in most cities, which kept buses accessible to working-class families, students, and anyone without access to a car. Rush hours turned vehicles into sardine cans, with standees packed tightly and the occasional good-natured grumble about personal space. Yet for all the crowding, buses remained indispensable, ferrying office workers downtown, shoppers to department stores, and children to school. In many neighborhoods, the arrival of the bus at a corner stop was as reliable a marker of time as a clock tower. Streetcars, by contrast, were largely fading into history. The great streetcar networks that had defined American cities in the first half of the century had been systematically dismantled after World War II. Economic pressures played the largest role. Maintaining tracks and overhead wires proved costly compared to the perceived flexibility of buses, especially as cities widened streets and built parking garages to accommodate cars. By 1960, fewer than a dozen cities still operated traditional streetcars. New Orleans preserved its St. Charles Avenue line, a picturesque route under live oaks that felt more like a moving landmark than mere transportation. San Francisco maintained its cable cars, not strictly streetcars, but close cousins, primarily for tourists navigating the steep hills. Philadelphia, Boston, Pittsburgh, and a few others retained limited trolley lines, often in tunnels or on private rights-of-way that made removal less practical. The decline sparked lasting myths about conspiracies involving automakers and oil companies, but the reality was more mundane, a combination of deferred maintenance, rising labor costs, and the seductive promise of federal highway funding. Subway systems in major cities told a story of endurance mixed with emerging strain. New York subway, the largest and most complex in the nation, carried upwards of 5 million passengers on peak days. The system expanded modestly during the decade with extensions on existing lines and the introduction of newer rolling stock. The R32 cars, delivered starting in 1964, brought stainless steel bodies, brighter lighting, and, crucially, air conditioning, a welcome relief in sweltering summer tunnels. Commuters unfolded newspapers, balanced briefcases, and endured the characteristic sway and screech of wheels on tracks. Tokens clattered into turnstiles, and platform conductors in distinctive caps ensured doors closed properly before departure. Reliability began to slip as the decade progressed. Budget constraints led to postponed maintenance, and by the late 1960s, graffiti and minor crime became more visible concerns. Yet the subway remained the lifeblood of the city, especially during massive events like the 1964 to 1965 World's Fair, when special express services and extended hours accommodated floods of visitors. Chicago's L system, a mix of elevated and subway lines, similarly soldiered on with a fleet that included older wooden cars alongside newer metal ones. Boston's MBTA, San Francisco's BART, which opened its first segment late in the decade, and Philadelphia's SEPTA maintained service amid growing financial pressures. Smaller systems in Cleveland and Newark persisted, though often with aging infrastructure. Intercity bus travel offered a distinctly American experience, dominated by Greyhound and its primary competitor, Trailways. Greyhound's Scenicruiser, that futuristic double-decker coach with its elevated upper lounge and panoramic windows, had captured imaginations since the mid-1950s and continued to ply major routes through the 1960s. Passengers boarded at grand Art Deco terminals in city centers, checked luggage underneath, and settled in for journeys that could span thousands of miles. Amenities varied. Reclining seats were standard, restrooms were available on longer coaches, and air conditioning spread gradually across the fleet. Smoking was permitted in designated sections, filling the air with a haze that today's travelers would find unimaginable. Stops at Howard Johnson's or local diners broke up the monotony, offering coffee and pie to weary riders. Fares were competitive with trains and far cheaper than flying, making the bus the democratic choice for students heading home, military personnel on leave, migrant workers, and families on modest vacations. Public transportation's social significance reached its peak during the civil rights movement. Segregated buses and terminals in the South remained flashpoints long after the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision. The Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 to 1956 had set a precedent, but enforcement lagged for interstate travel. In 1961, the Freedom Rides tested compliance with federal rulings prohibiting segregation on buses crossing state lines. Integrated groups boarded Greyhound and Trailways coaches, facing mob violence, arrests, and even the firebombing of a bus near Anniston, Alabama. The bravery of riders, many of them college students, forced the Kennedy administration to strengthen enforcement, and by the mid-1960s, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Interstate Commerce Commission regulations effectively ended legal segregation on public carriers. The change was profound. Waiting rooms, restrooms, and seating became integrated, though cultural attitudes shifted more gradually. Ridership statistics reveal the broader trend. Urban transit patronage peaked during World War II due to rationing and industrial mobilization, then declined steadily as car ownership exploded. By 1960, private automobiles outnumbered transit trips dramatically in most metropolitan areas outside the largest cities. The interstate highway system, authorized in 1956 and under aggressive construction throughout the 1960s, accelerated suburbanization and made commuting by car viable for millions. Federal policy heavily favored highways. Gasoline taxes funded roads, while transit received minimal support until the Urban Mass Transportation Act of 1964 provided seed money for capital improvements. Even then, operating subsidies remained limited, forcing many private operators into bankruptcy or public takeover. Canada's public transportation landscape shared similarities but exhibited greater continuity. Toronto's Toronto Transit Commission operated one of the largest streetcar networks in North America, with modern PCC cars gliding through mixed traffic on routes that radiated from the city center. The system's subway, opened in 1954, expanded with the Yonge University line, and buses filled gaps in coverage. Montreal relied primarily on buses and a small remaining trolleybus network, while Vancouver's BC Electric, later BC Hydro, operated trolleybuses extensively, a clean, quiet alternative in a city conscious of its natural setting. Passenger rail remained robust longer than in the United States, with Canadian National and Canadian Pacific maintaining extensive networks of named trains like the Canadian and the Dominion. A forward-looking development came in 1967 when GO Transit began commuter rail service in the Toronto area, using existing freight tracks to serve burgeoning suburbs, an innovation that influenced later systems worldwide. Latin America's public transportation in the 1960s reflected rapid urbanization and resource constraints. Megacities like Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, and Lima saw explosive growth, and privately operated buses became the dominant mode. These were often colorful, owner-operated vehicles. Many second-hand imports from the United States, competing fiercely for passengers along overlapping routes. Drivers or assistants shouted destinations from open doors, and vehicles frequently ran packed to capacity, with riders hanging from steps during peak hours. Fares were minimal, making buses accessible to the working masses, fueling industrial expansion. Trolley buses persisted in several cities. Mexico City maintained the largest network in the Western Hemisphere, with routes snaking through dense neighborhoods on overhead electric wires. Similar systems operated in Guadalajara, Quito, Rosario, and Valparaiso, offering pollution-free operation at a time when air quality concerns were beginning to emerge. Streetcars had largely disappeared earlier, though Buenos Aires retained its extensive subway system, the oldest in the Spanish-speaking world, dating to 1913. Investment lagged, however, leaving cars and infrastructure aging. Intercity travel across vast distances relied on long-distance coaches that connected capitals to provinces and rural areas. In Mexico, companies like Tres Estrellas de Oro and Autobuses de Oriente offered frequent service with basic but reliable vehicles. Argentina's colectivos extended beyond cities into provincial networks, while Brazil's rodoviarias, bus terminals, bustled with departures to every corner of the country. These services were vital for internal migration, as rural dwellers sought opportunities in growing urban centers. Across the hemisphere, the daily experience of public transportation carried common threads. Passengers developed unspoken etiquette, offering seats to the elderly, folding newspapers politely, enduring delays with stoic patience. Drivers became familiar figures in neighborhoods, sometimes greeting regulars by name. The sensory details linger in memory: the diesel scent of buses, the metallic tang of subway air, the clang of streetcar bells, the rhythmic announcement of stops over crackling speakers. Maintenance challenges grew universal. Aging fleets required constant repair, and labor disputes occasionally disrupted service. Funding shortages meant deferred upgrades, from repainting to replacing worn seats. Yet innovation persisted in pockets. Experiments with express bus lanes, one-way street systems to speed service, and early automated fare collection in a few forward-thinking cities. School transportation added another layer. Dedicated school buses, those familiar yellow behemoths, proliferated in North America, often operated by transit agencies or contractors. In Latin America, children frequently used regular city buses, adding youthful energy to morning routes. By the end of the decade, public transportation had carried the Americas through profound change. It facilitated civil rights advances, supported economic mobility, and sustained urban vitality even as suburbs sprawled. Buses groaned under loads in São Paulo traffic, subways rattled beneath Manhattan skyscrapers, streetcars glided past Toronto row houses, and coaches crossed endless prairies and mountains. The systems were imperfect, sometimes late, often crowded, occasionally breaking down. But they worked, day after day, moving millions with a quiet efficiency that belied their growing vulnerability. The 1960s thus represented both culmination and turning point. Public transit still commanded loyalty born of necessity and habit, yet the automobile's promise of door-to-door convenience proved irresistible to those who could afford it. Federal policies, urban planning decisions, and cultural shifts all pointed toward a future where cars would dominate. Yet in dense cores, for lower-income residents, and during events that overwhelmed roads, transit endured as essential infrastructure. Looking back, the era's public transportation evokes a certain nostalgia, not for discomfort or unreliability, but for the shared experience it fostered. Strangers became temporary communities on a morning commute, conversations sparked over delayed trains, and the simple act of boarding with a token or coin connected individuals to the larger pulse of society. The vehicles may have been basic, the schedules imperfect, and the crowds intense, but the systems delivered something profound: mobility for the many, at a time when the Americas were redefining themselves. In retrospect, the 1960s were the last decade when public transportation could still claim primacy in many lives across the continent. It carried workers to factories, students to expanding universities, families to parks and beaches, activists to marches, and dreamers to new beginnings. Clunky, smoky, noisy, and indispensable, it reflected the era's contradictions: progress and stagnation, inclusion and exclusion, tradition and transformation, all rolling along on rubber tires and steel wheels, one route at a time.